Oh, here's a stumper. Why would God tell the people of Israel to kill all the Canaanites?
You ever met a Canaanite? No. Sorry. I couldn't resist that one. There's several ways of looking at it. I mean, there's some people treat it like an historical question, as in what was necessary to cleanse the land so that they could, settle it. And actually, the early church fathers almost never resorted to historical answers on these questions. I had somebody trying to lecture me about the Antiochene school and the Alexandrian school, Antiochene being very historical and the Alexandrian being very, Hellenistic and symbolical. But the truth was the Antiochene school was dominated by Nestorians. There's a myth out there about it's actually a German 19th century scholarly myth that we have to have this balance of the two. The Eastern tradition of the church is, say this, after a fashion, unapologetically Platonic. I don't mean by that we follow Plato, though we certainly borrowed a great deal of his language. Certainly, without apology, the understanding about the relationship between the visible and invisible world and the nature of reality. The fathers are frequently clear that you will not understand what's going on in the scriptures if you stick with the letter. You have to go beneath the letter. The second century crisis with Marcionism, where he's talking about the God of the Old Testament was evil, the answer to Marcion in that century was not trying to defend the historicity of the Old Testament and say that was not how the arguments flew. Marcion, if anything, was the historicizer, forcing an historical reading on the Old Testament. Jesus says, you search the scriptures for you think in them you have eternal life. These are they who testify of me. And so you'll have things like the fathers reading the psalm where it talks about dashing their little ones' heads against a stone, which is awful. I mean, it's just hideous. And if you don't think it's hideous, you need fixing. Because, you've lost your sensibilities. It's supposed to be revolting. But they interpret it typically as referring to the little logos me, the little thoughts, that you have to very early, when they soon arise as they're little children, they first come up, smash them against the rock, who is Christ. That's their favorite way of doing it. You don't find a lot of them going into historical explanations of why it was really necessary to do this with Babylonian babies or something. And we are the inheritors in modernity of a radical historicization of reading things. And in the Protestant world, you have this bifurcation between fundamentalism, in which they read the Bible and say it's literally true. I don't care what your archaeology says, it's literally true. Versus the liberals who say the text means literally what it says, and therefore it's not true. And they are just flip sides of the same coin. And the tradition has just been sailing between that for 2,000 years. If I run into a passage like that, about the Canaanites, I do not waste my time trying to make excuses for God. Like, why would he do a thing like that? I think, I don't know if he did a thing like that. And then you say, well, why did it written like that? And I'd say, I don't know. But I do know how to read it and find Christ. And that's for myself, that's my only thing. The explaining why we do it that way is above my pay grade. But I'm looking for Jesus when I read the scriptures. I look for Christ. I do not know a God who is the God of genocide. I do not know such a God. When the disciples raised that kind of question, like, shall we call down fire from heaven to consume the Samaritan village that's not accepting you? Jesus looked at them and he was gobsmacked. as the English would say, and said, "You don't know what spirit you're of." And God, what he's like looking at the disciples and thinking, "What?" I mean, but there's a lot of people out there that are just absolutely praying for Jesus to send fire down. You know, at my hometown, Bob Jones University, there when Alexander Haig was Secretary of State, he refused entry to. What's his name from Ireland, who was a real Catholic hater, Ian Paisley, wouldn't let him come in. And so Dr. Bob, he was supposed to speak at Bob Jones University. Dr. Bob went on the radio and was praying that God would smite Alexander Haig hip and thigh. It was a really rich biblical phrase that I just thought, you don't know what spirit you're of. And in that sense, I want to say, you don't know Jesus. You don't know Jesus. Yeah. And that's a, I know there's a lot of people who would argue with me on that. I can show you lots of them on my blog. But I don't know another way to handle that. And I really, really, really find it difficult to dance around and make excuses for something I think is just awful. And I just think it just comes off weird. And instead, thank God for the Alexandrian fathers. St. Paul read the Old Testament the same way. So